So, what are the main subdivisions of white people and European civilization? I think there's a number of ways you could break it down. Like, you could break it down as in, like, say, old world versus new world. And I think there are actually some commonalities that new world or old world countries have in spite of what other categories they fit into. But I think ultimately, the main way in which it can be broken down is on an ethno-cultural basis. So I think there's four main categories, and I'm going to go into detail about who they are, who they include, and what traits they embody. So the first of the four main categories is the Anglos, and Anglos means Anglosphere as a whole. So that would include the UK, Ireland, Canada, with the exception of Quebec. Although Quebec could sort of be included simply because I think the influence of English Canadian culture on Quebec is still pretty strong. Quebec's in a gray area, as are the other, like the French parts of New Brunswick, and I guess the few remaining French parts of Ontario. But yeah, US as a whole, although not the like parts that are like extremely Hispanic or the parts that are extremely black. Those would be just like not really part of European civilization at all. Or maybe in the case of the Hispanic ones, some might be part of the Mediterranean, which I'll get into later. But yeah. So Anglo would get most of the U.S., most of Canada. It also would not include the parts that are like extremely native, like Nunavut, or Hawaii necessarily. Hawaii's iffy, but yeah, most of US, most of Canada, and again, Australia, New Zealand, same thing applies with like the very native regions, but as a whole, yes, Australia, New Zealand. So, and yeah, UK and Ireland. Now I include Ireland, even though they don't really always see themselves as part of the Anglosphere, but the fact is they do speak English as their main language. And I think as much as they may deny it, I think they have been absorbed into Anglo culture in many ways, even if they absolutely hate the UK. And they have adopted many Anglo cultural norms. So, what are the defining traits of the Anglo subset of European civilization? I would say capitalism and individualism are the main ones. There's a strong belief in efficiency, mud GDP, and the idea of the free market. I would say that is by far the strongest cultural aspect that differentiates the Anglos from the rest of Western civilization. It's also something that, in my opinion, they take way too far, which I've talked about quite a bit in many of my videos. So, yeah, I would say they also value orderliness, but I would not say they value orderliness the most. I would say that's the Germanics, and I'll get to them in a second. But yeah, I would say overall the main traits of the subset of European civilization, the Anglo sub-civilization, are individualism and capitalism, and to a slightly lesser extent, orderliness. So the next category is the Germanics. And I would say the Germanics are the most orderly by far. They very strongly value orderliness. In fact, I would argue that they are in some ways even close to like Japanese or Koreans in terms of how much they value orderliness. Like they would be some of the highest on earth for that. Like for instance, if you go on a train in Germany, it's very quiet. And I've seen videos of trains in Japan where it's the same. And yeah, like they're very like, they believe strongly in like a very orderly and clean society. Like there's not much graffiti. There's not much, well, there are sometimes in immigrant neighborhoods, but if it's not an immigrant neighborhood, there won't be much graffiti. People tend to be quiet. Everything tends to be very orderly. I would say they're less capitalistic than the Anglos. They do believe strongly in efficiency, but they don't believe as strongly in like free, unregulated markets and a lack of government intervention in the economy. Like they are more okay with certain somewhat socialistic measures, but nonetheless, they do still believe very strongly in efficiency, much like the Anglos do. And they believe in orderliness even more strongly than the Anglos do. So yeah, I would say those are the dominant values of Germanic, the Germanic sub-civilization. And that would include Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. It would include Flanders, so it would include the Flemish part of Belgium. It would include the German part of Switzerland. And I would argue that in this day and age, again, some of these places that kind of fit into none of the above, what often happens is they latch on to the one that's simply geographically and culturally closest, even if they have a different ethnic heritage. So I said that like for like the Irish with the Anglos. And I think for the Germanics, the Finns do fit into this category where they're not technically Germanics, but I'd argue they are essentially part of this group simply due to cultural and geographical similarities. Also, like, frankly, the Cold War has a lot to do with that. Because, say, for instance, Finns are similar culturally to Estonians, Latvians, and Lithuanians, but I'd put them in a different category, the Slavic, which I'll get to later, simply because of the lingering effects of the Cold War and how it divided different societies. So yeah, I'd say the Finns are kind of an honorary part of this group also. And Icelandics, yes, would be part of this group. Yeah, so that would be the Germanics. The next category would be Mediterraneans. Now, I would say Mediterranean countries include obviously Spain, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Malta. I would also include France, and I would include the French parts of Switzerland and Belgium, so Wallonia in Belgium. Quebec is, again, as I said before, Quebec's kind of a gray area. Honestly, it's very hard to categorize in this regard because as a French-speaking place, it is part of Mediterranean civilization, but I would argue the influence of English Canada is so strong that can I really call it part of this subset of European civilization? I don't know. It's borderline. It's on the fence. I would also include insofar as they're part of European civilization. I would include Latin America, especially like Argentina, Uruguay, southern Brazil, Chile, like the kind of whiter, more culturally European parts of Latin America could be considered part of this. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, yeah, the white South Africans would be affiliated somewhat with Anglo and Germanic civilization, the sub-civilizations also. Depending on which linguistic group they're part of, the English or the Boers, the Afrikaners. So yeah, with Mediterranean, the reason why I said Mediterranean, not Latin, is because I do include Greece in this because I feel they cluster more, like Greece and Cyprus and Malta cluster more with this, despite not speaking Latin-based languages. In the case of Greece and Cyprus, they don't even use the Latin alphabet. So technically, we're more Latin than they are in that regard. But nonetheless, I think there is a strong cultural similarity. Like Greeks and Italians and Mediterraneans in general do have a lot of strong cultural similarities. Like they talk about the PIGS acronym in the European Union: Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain. Yeah, these countries, I would say, okay, their dominant values are beauty and cultural preservation, which are also my dominant values, to be honest. So in that way, I guess I'm trans-Mediterranean, despite not being very Mediterranean genetically, like probably less than like 3% or whatever, 4%, 5%, I don't know, at most. But like, yeah, I identify with their dominant values a lot because I think these are good values to hold. They value the preservation of beauty, the preservation of culture. So like in terms of architecture, food, art, like things of that nature. Like they very strongly believe in a life centered around the creation and preservation of beauty. And yeah, I think that is their dominant value. So it's expressed in many forms of art and culture, in terms of how they also their attitude toward religion and religious ceremony. Um, the downside is that they're not always the most economically productive region, and I do think that is kind of the Achilles heel of that. So I mean, which is why I think some countries that are on the borderline manage to strike a bit of a good balance, like say Austria does, some parts of northern Italy do, like places that are on that kind of fault line between the different sub regions of European civilization. So yeah, that would be Mediterranean civilization and sub civilization. And the final one would be Slavic sub civilization. So that would essentially include all of Eastern Europe, and Russia. And it would also include, I would say, again, on an honorary basis, the countries that are in Eastern Europe that were part of the Warsaw Pact that are not technically Slavic. I would still say they cluster with Slavic sub-civilizations simply because due to the events of the Cold War, they've kind of been just linked together. But I would say they haven't always historically been that way. Like the lines between these sub-civilizations have kind of moved over the years. Like, for instance, I wouldn't have necessarily grouped the Baltic states in with them prior to the Cold War. I might have said if in some ways they might be lumped in a bit more with Germanic sub-civilization before the Cold War, before the Soviet Union. But nowadays, I would say they're more lumped in with Slavic sub-civilization simply for that reason. So like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. But yeah, it would include all the former Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe, plus Russia itself. Plus you could include some that are like debatably European, like Armenia and Georgia. It would, as I said, it would not include Greece. It would not include Cyprus. It would not include, okay, insofar as Turks are, I don't really consider Turkey part of European civilization, but if you were to consider them at all, they would cluster more with the Mediterranean sub-civilization and not with this one. So again, like there are some countries that are Orthodox currently or in the past that would cluster more with Mediterranean civilization. So and furthermore, many of these Slavic countries are actually Catholic. And some even have a lot of Protestants, like, well, the Baltic ones, which aren't technically Slavic, but which cluster with this group. So what are the dominant values of Slavic civilization? That's an interesting one. They're actually the hardest one to pin down in terms of what their dominant values are. I would say traditionalism, like gender roles, very strong sense of ethnic solidarity. I would also say they're a bit more survival based in their thinking, kind of practical. I will say, in terms of some things though, like in terms of a lot of the other values I mentioned for the other three subgroups, I actually think they can vary quite a bit. Like, for instance, in terms of like whether they value, let's say, like whether they're more individual, I'd say they tend to be a bit more collectivist on average. But I would also say that how capitalist or socialist they are today can vary a lot from country to country. And also just how much of an emphasis they put on productivity versus leisure, or say modernism versus traditionalism. Like, I'd say they all emphasize traditionalism in terms of like family values and things like nationalism and gender roles. But in terms of like art and architecture, for instance, I would say the degree to which they value traditionalism would vary a lot based on the country. But yeah, I would say overall that would be their dominant values, is basically traditionalism and nationalism. I would say those would be their dominant values, like in terms of gender, ethnicity, religion, traits of that nature. So yeah, overall, I would say those are the four main subcategories within European civilization and the traits that define them.